Hello, my dear students, and welcome back to class of English. Today we are going to do chapter number 5 of your book Flamingo, that is Indigo. Indigo is a main part of Indian national movement of history, and this chapter is written by Louis Fisher about Mahatma Gandhi. This is the biography of Mahatma Gandhi written by an American journalist, Louis Fisher. Let's read something about our writer. The famous American journalist Mr. Louis Fisher came to India in May in 1942. He was in India for 2 months. The World War was in full swing at that time. In the scorching heat of June, he spent 1 week with Gandhiji in this ashram, and Gandhiji gave him 1 hour daily. He could also talk with Gandhiji during other activities such as eating, walking, etc. Fisher wrote a book, 7 Days with the Mahatma. In this book, he has described the ashram life and Gandhiji's likes and dislikes in a very touching way. He wrote that he never felt afraid in Gandhiji's presence. His association with Gandhiji was warm, healthy, full of joy and cordial. He found Gandhiji a cultured, able and always refreshing and sweet person. Louis Fisher has described the wonders of Gandhiji's personality in the book. Similarly, many persons stayed in this ashram from time to time. The book that we are reading in this chapter about is The Life of Mahatma Gandhi. As Sir Richard Attenborough said, this is the best biography of Gandhi, and it is written by Louis Fisher. In the chapter Indigo that we are talking about in our video, the main theme covered by the author is that how an effective leadership can overcome any problem. The chapter tells us about the leadership shown by Mahatma Gandhi to secure justice for the oppressed people through convincing argumentation and negotiation. The story is based on the interview taken by Louis Fisher of Mahatma Gandhi. So Louis Fisher has been taking an interview of Mahatma Gandhi in this chapter that we are going to read, and the chapter is narrated in first person. That means the writer has narrated his interview in his words in first person. In order to write on him, he had visited him in 1942 at his ashram in Sevagram, where he was told about the Indigo movement started by Gandhiji. Gandhiji told Louis Fisher about his Indigo movement when Fisher visited Mahatma Gandhi in 1942 at his ashram in Sevagram. The story revolves around the struggle of Gandhi and other prominent leaders in order to safeguard the sharecroppers from the atrocities of landlords. The chapter begins with a very important character, that is Rajkumar Shukla. Rajkumar Shukla was the main reason, was the main cause of this big movement, Champaran movement, that became the foundation stone of Indian freedom struggle. Rajkumar Shukla was a poor sharecropper who was a victim of British landlords. Though he was illiterate, but he was very, very resolute. You will come across this statement in the chapter also, that Rajkumar Shukla was though illiterate, but he was very, very resolute, as he was determined to fight against the injustice of British landlords and to fight them. And to fight them, he goes to meet Gandhiji to seek his help. Gandhiji was extremely busy, but because of his resoluteness, because of his determination, he followed Gandhiji everywhere, and it was because of his untiring efforts that Rajkumar Shukla and Gandhiji came to Champaran village in Bihar. Shukla was able to convince Gandhiji to come to Bihar to solve the problem of indigo sharecropping system. Later, this struggle with British landlords became a turning point in the fight for the independence of India. And as you can see here, the Indian government has launched a stamp also in the name of Rajkumar Shukla, because later on he became a very important character, a very important personality in the Indian history of freedom struggle. The story begins, the Champaran episode rather begins in December 1916, when Rajkumar Shukla actually approached Gandhiji. Gandhiji had gone to Lucknow to attend the annual convention of Indian National Congress. There were 2,301 delegates and many visitors, and a peasant from Champaran named Rajkumar Shukla asked Gandhi to visit his district. Shukla followed Gandhi wherever he went. This shows his resoluteness, that how determined he was. Though he was illiterate, but he was convinced that Gandhiji was the man who could help him out in this trouble of indigo sharecropping. So in 1917, Gandhi and Shukla boarded a train from Patna, and Shukla led Gandhi to the house of a lawyer named Rajendra Prasad. So this is Rajendra Prasad, as you can see, who later on became the first president of free India. On the way, they had stopped at Rajendra Prasad's house, but they could not see him as he was out of town. Mahatma Gandhi was not very popular at that time. When both of them reached Rajendra Prasad's house, his servants did not let Gandhiji drink a drop of water from the well in the house, because they believed that because Mahatma Gandhi had been accompanying a poor yeoman, a peasant Rajkumar Shukla, so they thought that Gandhi was also a peasant. Gandhi was also an untouchable. So if they touched the water from the well, the water would be polluted. So they did not allow Gandhiji to drink water from the well. After staying at Rajendra Prasad's house, Gandhiji decided to go to Muzzafarpur. You can see here, Muzzafarpur is located here. From Muzaffarpur to obtain complete information about the conditions in Champaran. He reached Muzaffarpur by train at midnight on 15th April 1917. At Professor J.B. Kriplani house, he stayed there. This is Professor J.B. Kriplani who received him at the station, and Gandhi stayed there for 2 days. The news of Gandhi's arrival and the nature of his mission spread quickly through Muzaffarpur and to Champaran. So this is Muzaffarpur, as you can see here, and this is the adjacent Champaran. Sharecroppers from Champaran began arriving there. All the indigo sharecroppers, when they came to know that somebody had come there who was ready to fight for their cause, they arrived there in large numbers. Muzaffarpur lawyers briefed Gandhiji, informed Gandhiji about the court cases. He chided the lawyers, he scolded the lawyers as the lawyers were collecting heavy fees from the sharecroppers. Gandhiji thought that the law courts were useless for the crushed and fear-stricken peasants. The relief for them was to be free from fear. The real relief would be not the relief from the courts, but to be free from the fear of the British. Now, this is the most important thing in the chapter, as this is about the Champaran problem. What actual Champaran indigo sharecropping was. Most of the arable land means on which you can grow something that is fertile, that can be cultivated. Most of the arable land in the Champaran district was divided into large estates, and they were owned by Englishmen and worked by Indian tenants. That means Indian people used to cultivate the land, and in lieu of that they used to pay rent, some money, for being tenants on their own land. The chief commercial crop was indigo. Indigo is that blue powder जो नील हम कपड़ों को देते हैं, that is called indigo. So that was the chief commercial crop. The landlords compelled all tenants, means forced all the Indian farmers to plant 3/20ths or 15% of their holdings with indigo and surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent. This was done by long-term contract. That means from one generation to other, from other to the next. This long-term contract had been going on, that families were forced to to surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent to the Britishers. Presently, the landlords, the Britishers, learned that Germany had developed synthetic indigo. The actual indigo crop was very costly in the market, but when the Britishers learned that Germany had developed synthetic indigo, they thereupon obtained agreements from the sharecroppers to pay them compensation for being released from the 15% arrangement. Britishers were very clever. They knew that Indian farmers had no knowledge about the synthetic indigo, and the prices of the original indigo crop were going to be slashed in the international market, and they will lose everything. So they had this plan. They forced the Indian farmers to pay them 15% of their arrangement, and they wanted to have agreements from them where they wanted to free them from this 15% arrangement, and in view of that they had to sign an agreement. The sharecropping arrangement was irksome, irritating to the peasants, and many signed willingly. When the farmers came to know that in view of some money they will give to the Britishers, and in return for that they will have their land, they will get their land back, and those who resisted engaged lawyers, the landlords hired thugs. Meanwhile, the information about synthetic indigo reached the illiterate peasants who had signed and who they wanted their money back. So when the poor peasants learned about the synthetic indigo and how they had been cheated by the British landlords, they felt like they need their money back. They wanted their money back. Many of them had signed willingly, many of them were forced just to sign these agreements. But now when they realized the cheat that had been done by the Britishers, they wanted their money back. When Gandhiji arrived there, he began by trying to get the facts from the secretary of the British Landlords Association. He refused to give information to an outsider. Who? The secretary of the British Landlords Association. Gandhiji went to meet him, but he refused to give any information to an outsider. So now who is an outsider here? Gandhiji is considered to be an outsider here. But Gandhiji said that he was not an outsider. After meeting the secretary of the British Landlords Association and being treated very badly by him, he next called on the British official commissioner of the Tirhat division. This is the map of the Tirhat division. All these districts, all these divisions lay under Tirhat division at that time. The commissioner started bullying Gandhi and advised him to leave Tirhat. So, like British Landlords Association secretary, British official commissioner also bullied him and advised him to leave Tirhat division. But Gandhiji, instead of leaving the area, he went to Motihari, the capital of Champaran. Several lawyers accompanied him, and a large crowd of people greeted Gandhi at the railway station. And this was the beginning of the liberation from fear of the British. Gandhiji learned that a peasant had been maltreated in a nearby village. The next morning, he started out on the back of an elephant. Soon he was stopped by the police superintendent's messenger and ordered to return to town in his carriage. Gandhi complied. Complied means he obeyed the orders to return. The messenger drove Gandhi home. Then he served him with an official notice to quit Champaran at once. Gandhi signed the receipt for the notice. That means he signed that he had received the notice, and on the notice he replied and wrote that he would disobey the order. And this was the beginning of the civil disobedience movement for the first time in India. Gandhi received summon to appear in court the next day. As a result of disobeying the orders of the court, he was asked to appear in the court the next day. At night, Gandhiji telegraphed Rajendra Prasad. But remember, Rajendra Prasad was not the president of India at that time. He was merely a lawyer at that time. Gandhiji sent instructions to the ashram and wired a full report to the viceroy. As soon as the peasants learned that Gandhiji was fighting for them and for that they had been summoned by the court, thousands of peasants gathered around the courthouse. This was the first time that the Indian peasants had showed unity, integration. The officials felt powerless because the crowd had gathered in thousands of numbers. The authorities wished to consult their superiors, but Gandhiji protested against the delay. The magistrate announced that he would pronounce sentence after a 2-hour recess, and he asked Gandhi to furnish bail for 120 minutes. But Gandhiji refused. He said, "You put me in jail for 2 hours. I am ready to go to the jail," but he refused to take bail. The judge released him without bail, and the court started again after a break. The judge said he would not deliver the judgment for several days, and Gandhiji was allowed to remain at liberty. Many days later, the case against Gandhiji was dropped also, and this was the victory of civil disobedience movement against the Britishers. After several days, Gandhi was informed by the magistrate that the case had been dropped. For the first time in modern India, civil disobedience had triumphed. So if you have this question that what was the first time when civil disobedience movement had triumphed in India, you can quote this incident when Gandhiji was summoned in the court and the peasants had shown their uh, unity and their integration against the Britishers, and when Gandhiji had first time disobeyed the civil orders of the Britishers. Gandhi and lawyers conducted an inquiry into the complaints of the peasants. After that incident, Gandhiji once again get back to his task of indigo sharecropping problems, and about 10,000 peasants deposed documents that were collected. Gandhi was summoned by Sir Edward Gate, the Lieutenant Governor. This is Sir Edward Gate, the Lieutenant Governor, who was looking into the sharecropping problem of the indigo planters. He met the Lieutenant Governor 4 times, and because of the result of this meeting, an official commission of inquiry was appointed to look into this problem. The official inquiry assembled evidence against the British planters. So, in this inquiry, there were huge evidences which were gathered against the big planters, against the Britishers, which showed that the British landlords were doing injustice to the Indian tenants. They agreed in principle to make refunds to the peasants because they had collected huge evidence against the Britishers. So the Britishers once agreed in principle to give the money back to the peasants. But the question was how much? They thought that Gandhiji will ask the full repayment and they will not give the full payment, and the conversation will come into a deadlock. But Gandhiji asked only 50%. The representatives of the planters offered refund up to 25%. Britishers were very, very clever. They were not ready to give also 50% of that amount. They said they cannot give more than 25%. And they thought Gandhiji will never agree to 25% and the situation will come into a deadlock again. They will not have to give anything to the peasants because Gandhiji will not agree to a refund of 25%. But surprisingly, Gandhiji agreed. So this is a very, very important question, that why did Gandhiji agree to only 25% of the refund, breaking the deadlock? Gandhiji explained the reason himself. This is the reason that he gave for his action. He said that the amount of the refund was less important than the fact that the landlords had been forced to give some money and their prestige. So, according to Gandhiji, what was important was not the amount of money, but what was more important was that it was the first time that landlords were forced to give something. Landlords were not ready to give anything, but now they had first time agreed to give 25% of the money, and not only they were ready to surrender 25% of the money, but also a part of their prestige. So this is the Champaran episode where Mohandas became Mahatma. The peasant, because of this movement, saw that he had rights and defenders. That means he understood that he had people who could fight for him. The peasant learned courage. The events justified Gandhi's position, and within a few years, the British planters abandoned their estates. As a result of Gandhiji's efforts, the British landlords abandoned their estates, left the estates, and the land came back to the real owners, that were Indian farmers. These now went back to the peasants, and indigo sharecropping disappeared completely. So, this was the indigo sharecropping problem on which our chapter is named and based. Gandhiji did not stop only there. Gandhiji wanted to do something to remove the cultural and social backwardness in Champaran villages. This is a very important question from the point of view of exams also. You have this question that what did Gandhiji do for cultural and social upliftment of Champaran villages? So you can see that he appealed for teachers. He asked the help for teachers who could volunteer to teach, to educate the illiterate Indians. Two young disciples of Gandhi, that is Mahadev Desai, as you can see, and Narhari Parekh. These two volunteers came to help him, and their wives volunteered for work. Several more volunteers like these two came from Bombay, Pune, and other distant parts of the land. Devdas, Gandhi's youngest son. So this is Devdas Gandhi, who was Mahatma Gandhi's youngest son. He also arrived from the ashram along with his mother, the wife of Mahatma Gandhi, Mrs. Kasturba Gandhi. Primary schools were opened in 6 villages. Kasturba Gandhi taught the ashrams rules on personal cleanliness and community sanitation. Health conditions were very, very miserable at that time. Gandhiji got a doctor to volunteer his services for 6 months. There were only three types of medicines available at that time: castor oil, quinine, and sulfur ointment. One to drink, one to eat, and one to apply. Gandhi noticed the filthy, dirty state of women's clothes. One woman told Kasturba that he had only one sari, and it was at this time that Gandhiji taught the lesson of self-reliance and asked people to spin the wheel and make their cloth themselves. During his long stay in Champaran, Gandhi kept a long distance watch on the ashram and sent regular instructions by mail. Gandhiji also taught his followers a lesson in self-reliance. This is a very, very important question from the exam point of view also, that how did Gandhiji teach his followers a lesson in self-reliance? Gandhiji had an English friend, a Britisher whose name was Charles Freed Andrews. Gandhiji's lawyer friends thought that he would be a good idea for Charles Freed Andrews, he was an English pacifist, to stay in Champaran and help them. Gandhiji's disciple Andrew was a great follower of Gandhiji. If Gandhiji would have asked Charles Freed Andrews to stay in Champaran and help him, he would have willingly stayed there. Andrews was willing if Gandhi agreed, but Gandhiji opposed it forcefully. He said the cause is just. That means the reason of fight is fair. And he said that you must rely upon yourselves to win the battle. Thus, self-reliance, Indian independence, and help to sharecroppers were all bound together. Gandhiji taught the people to be self-reliant, not to be dependent upon Charles Freed Andrews because he was a Britisher. He thought that including a Britisher along with them will not then make case more strong or stronger. They were fighting for the good cause, they were fighting for the right, fair cause, and their fight was justified, and he was sure to win this battle himself. Thank you.